Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Chassie. I'm going to be facilitating this session, and I want to thank each of you for participating in the session. How can you support your students differently? And I think that we could all agree that this session very much aligns with the conference theme of New Horizons, because I feel it embodies things like perseverance, change, and most importantly, hope. And the COVID-19 pandemic has been the most extraordinary global event that I think we've experienced in our lifetimes, and has fundamentally changed how we operate as individuals and collectively as a society. And I think we all know this most certainly includes international education and the student experience. So I want to start off by asking you, Belle, as an international student, what was your experience like prior to the pandemic, and how has it changed since?
Thank you, Robert, for having me in this session. So a lot of the issues that we see now that are plaguing international students' experience over the past 12 to 18 months are not new, such as mental health, accommodation, safety, and community integration. These are kind of long-standing issues that we know that international students do experience. But what the pandemic has done is that it has amplified some of these issues. And some of the key points that I want to share with the audience today are, firstly, the COVID-19 enhanced financial pressure. Financial vulnerabilities that students have become very obvious to us during this time. And sometimes I think about my personal experience and from my fellow students, it is very natural for us to be in this position because we are young people in our early 20s, or some of us are under 20s, and we don't have a full-time income, and many of us actually need to work part-time to supplement quite high living expenses here in Australia. It is expected that students will have family who support us financially, and most of us absolutely do require that. But taking into account the currency exchange, the financial investment that the families make are actually very high. And during COVID, I know personally of students whose families have lost income back home, and through no fault of their own, they're all of a sudden facing this situation where their entire education and life here in Australia are in jeopardy. There's also, this element that students feel guilty that they're spending a large amount of family savings on their education, and especially for students that are currently stuck offshore, this doesn't match up with what they sign up for. They're learning, online learning experience with a full experience of actually learning in Australia. So this is one big problem that we are facing. The two other points that I'll quickly raise are, firstly, the increased social exclusion. Students typically don't live in mansion, as you can see behind me. We don't have large spaces to move around, and you have students stuck in small areas. And in this lockdown situation, without the support network of family and friends, it is very difficult. And lastly, a very heartbreaking issue that is discrimination and racism. We did observe a rise in racist comments and reports to us. And recently we ran a survey from students that told us about, their experiences. We have students from Asian countries like myself feeling like we are being targeted, and they avoid going to supermarket because they get yelled at and saying that it's our fault. And there are also things like students actively avoiding interacting with strangers in anticipation of this kind of behavior, leading to social withdrawal. So here are, some of the issues that we knew initially, but it has been amplified.
Wow, yeah, that sounds like it has, like you said, it hasn't completely changed, but has definitely amplified. And Nathan, I want to ask you, with your experience working with the Queensland Department of Education, what impacts to the student experience and the student journey have you seen since the pandemic?
Thank you, Robert. I couldn't agree with you any more, Belle, particularly around, the emphasis there on amplifying some issues from a policy point of view. And we here at the department are looking after 100 schools with thousands of international students that are under the age of 18. I agree that some of our policies have got cracks in them that we've had to address, through some stronger risk mitigation. And I suppose we could have never foreseen the scale of the issues that it was going to create. And in reflection, when I think back to that January period in 2020, we were really in a position where we had displacement on a large scale. We had students that were facing that realisation that do I go home? Do I do the dash now and go back home to country, or do I wait this out and do I stay and pursue my study? And then we had students that were on the other side of the world that were still waiting to come back. They're still on holidays, that were faced with that proposition of, well, what's the next steps for me as a student? And also you mentioned accommodation too, Belle. Absolutely. From supporting younger overseas students, our approach is homestay here in Queensland for government schools. And we had that realisation straight away that this is going to cause issues with extra strains on our homestay network and our families, who all of a sudden are left supporting an international student, somebody that would traditionally go home over breaks throughout the year, that would no longer have that as a choice. You also mentioned student wellbeing. That was absolutely at the forefront of our policies, and particularly around that realisation of the financial pressures. And in your case, you as an adult, that financial pressure on you, but for our cohort of students, the financial pressures on our parents of our students who are offshore. And because of the wide scale of COVID, it was impacting the financial incomes of all families, let alone the homestay families and the international students here. And those added pressures, particularly around a young person having to process socially and culturally the media attention, the focus on where the origins of COVID come from, and whether the discrimination was direct or indirect, it still had such an impact on young people in our schools. And probably two more quick points, and one was around it wasn't just the students that were impacted. We had the staff of our schools were overwhelmingly impacted by this, and just Murphy's Law, when would you have lockdowns? You would have them every time that schools are on, supposed to be on a break, and that would add extra, impacts to the staff wellbeing. And lastly, their environment. When you think about Queensland and Australia, we are a relatively perceived safe destination, but COVID unfortunately has challenged that. And is there really any city or country that can be potentially COVID safe? So these are some of the experiences that we've worked through here as a department.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, what I'm hearing is that it's bringing up a lot of, complexity surrounding student issues with not only how they're seeking support, but how education providers are meeting those needs in, what you're saying here, like a personalized and, more importantly, a scalable way. So firstly, Dr. Jamie, I would like to ask you, from your perspective as the medical director at Sonder, what support trends and new support needs have you seen with students? And then to both you and Nathan, how has Sonder and the Department of Education been meeting those needs at the institutional level?
Got it. I mean, Belle, Nathan, you raised those points, and Belle, it's a lived experience. I've not been through it as a student, but I have been through it as an immigrant. I studied overseas and then I emigrated here as well. And it is about complexity, isn't it, Belle and Nathan? It's about, I work in the system. I'm a doctor within the healthcare system. And when I came to Australia, I didn't understand it. I didn't understand it. And I was entitled to Medicare. And in my role as an ED doc, I see a lot of students coming in. They're worried. There's language barriers, there's cultural barriers, and there's huge financial barriers that you raised about accessing care. Where do I go? How much is it going to cost? What's that going to impact on me? But how's that going to impact on my family who are supporting me as well? And that's why I joined Sonder, because we realized we could probably help people navigate that complexity. And when you don't know what to do and you don't know who you turn to, what we wanted to be was be there. And certainly, Bobby, the trends that we've seen with our international students is, I'm confused, I'm overwhelmed, I'm stressed, and I don't know who to turn to because my normal support networks aren't there. Certainly, the vast majority of interactions we have are outside normal working hours. 97% of start via chat. And the beauty of that is we can use software to talk to people in their native language. By chatting to the native language, we start to build trust. And that's what I'm hearing from Belle and we hear from our students. It's about a loss of trust. And we as an Australian community have got to rebuild that trust. And that's why, I'm working with people like Nathan and Belle to try and rebuild that trust. And in terms of trends, it's no different to what everybody else is seeing around the world. It's stress, it's anxiety and depression, and it's loneliness, it's disconnection, like Belle said. You're isolated in your room, your normal social networks gone. And certainly that's the experience that we're starting to see from the papers recently published in the UK. They've been very clear. They've done huge studies looking at what happens to people's mental health during and after COVID. And the evidence is clear. It primarily affects young people. People under 30 are the people most grossly impacted by it with mental health as a result of COVID. Primarily affects females, primarily affects people who are culturally and linguistically diverse, people who are not originally from that nation, and people who are isolated. And so those are the trends we've seen, Bobby, and it's about working with students individually, but also the community, people like Nathan, and saying, hey, Nathan, how can we help you? We know all of this stuff about people, but we need to rebuild that trust, connect them with their support network, and make them understand that they're a really valuable part of the Australian community. I mean, if you look on this call, there's 3 of us here who all live in Australia. Well, I'm born in Australia. We're all active participants in Australia. And for me, that's why I came to Australia, because it's that warm, safe country that you described, Nathan.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jamie. And, with Sonder and the Department of Education, I know you're making an effort to meet those needs. And Nathan, what has the department been doing in terms of addressing some of these issues in this change environment?
Yeah, thank you there, Bobby. Absolutely. I think at the forefront, we had 2 different cohorts of students that we were particularly interested in working with. And part of our core values in behind what we do here as the department is to make those strong realizations when we don't have a strong policy center support structure in place, that we need to leverage our partnering and collaborating with others. So we had the foundations of a really good system here in Queensland in behind our 1-800 Choose Study support hotline, but we soon realised that we needed help in making sense of this world and the over communication and the media sensation. We needed some way of rationalising the help, and that was certainly outside of the scope of potentially what we could do as a department with our amazing network of school staff and wellbeing staff that we have. But we also had that realisation that we can't just clock off after 10 weeks, a school term, or when we get to holidays. Like, the students needed support when we were going to go off on to vacation. So we had to think outside the box and think differently. So the 2 initiatives that we worked on with Sonder was, one, supporting our homestay students. So our students that are in accommodation, particularly those of our younger students. And so they have the Sonder care package. And I think, for the reasons that I stated before around some of these issues that we identified, safety, COVID challenges the notion of Queensland being a safe place. It also takes that pressure off the homestay family, because not every student will want to identify or have those personal conversations with their homestay families, as not every student will identify with their teaching staff. And Belle, I'm sure you can relate to this from a university perspective, that you will levitate as a young person towards who you want to share information with, and particularly personal health information and medical information. And having the right people to talk to with the right profession, like Jamie, it's critical that we're connecting our young people with health professionals. We also, needed to help make sense of all of the information that they actually get through their overseas health insurance providers, and also all different free forums, beyond health, etc., etc. There is so much information out there, including Dr. Google, that young people like to levitate to. So working with Jamie was a great opportunity for us to really give that key messaging back to our students around, this is on-demand help. This is somebody that you can rely on and communicate in a way that you want to be communicated to with as well.
Yeah,
Jamie.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Jamie, about that application. What are your thoughts in particular around what we're working on in that area?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Belle was talking about. It's about flattening power gradients, isn't it, Belle? When you're new to Australia, the care provider is up here, and you as the new person in Australia, especially if you don't speak the language, I knew this when I lived in France, it's really hard. You feel that power gradient, and that was the whole point of the product. It's just to flatten that power gradient and just say, hey, no problem's too big for us. It's totally confidential. What can we do? People will ring up or get in touch via chat with the simplest problem. And when you unpack it, actually, it's really complex because of all those reasons that Belle was talking about. And that's why we want to involve all our students in making our product better. Because actually, it's not us who decides whether it's a good experience, is it, Nathan? It's the students. It's our members who tell us. And that's a core part of flattening that power gradient, saying, we are here to help you, tell us how to make this better.
Yeah, I reflect on that one, particularly around that deep dive that we took with one of our students with a different application that we're working with Sonder on, with the returning international students to Queensland. So this was an interesting partnership that we formed. And what we as the department wanted, we wanted a solution that Sonder could pre-engage with our students prior to departure and then during those 14 days of quarantine. This student that we explored his experience, I was fascinated to see the amount of engagements that Sonder had with this student, and not through the traditional sense of communication as well. There was definitely phone conversations, there was email conversations and notifications, but it was interesting that this young person levitated towards SMS notifications as his primary choice. But in this application, I must say, and we are intending on scaling this up with the return of more international students, because it gives us the confidence as a department that we are finding ways to provide quality services to international students that keep their parents assured that we've got their safety and their well-being in the best interest.
Great. And, I know we're getting close to time, but, Belle, I'm hearing that there's been a lot of the kind of taken on board of the student voice in developing these type of programs. But I really want to know from you, how important do you think it is for the students to be involved in the designing of the changing of these programs to meet the new complexities and the new challenges?
Yes, certainly. So, the issues that we discussed earlier are long-standing and they've been in existence for more than a decade. So it is time to rethink. Robert, you're absolutely right. That's why I really like the topic today about thinking, how can we do this differently? And, from my role at CESA, I've observed firsthand the importance of having students at the table. And I absolutely want to acknowledge a number of stakeholders in the state and federal governments and sector peak bodies, including the Council for International Education, of course, Sonder, and the Queensland government, who actively seek out student representation. And I think that what is transformative on top of consultation is integrating students in the process. Having students involved in the process allow us to have deeper insights, and the initiatives that you create will actually serve the objectives and purpose of helping students. The co-design process also makes students feel invested in the project and really ultimately save resources for us. Like what Jamie and Nathan said earlier, we think that it is not enough to see students as customers. It is time to see students as partners, and that will ultimately, serve the benefit of everyone. Another message that I really want to share in this session is also how we need to take into account the cultural sensitivity. I think the support services that universities and education providers and other service providers absolutely need to take into account the different background and diversity that our students have in order for them to be effective. And lastly, we also need staff and community on our campuses to have the level of cultural competence.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you said, look at us look at this as a partnership. I think that's absolutely key. So look, I think that brings us to time, and I want to thank all of you again for sharing your insights, your thoughts, your experiences on how we can together as a sector change the way that we support students in a real meaningful way. So thank you again. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and stay safe. Thanks.
Thanks
Thank
all.
Thank you.